40 years ago, the Cultural Revolution swept through the People's Republic of China. A lot of people know that during that time, many freedoms for Christians were taken away, and persecution got even more intense. Uncle Monnie is a gospel worker who has worked with and encouraged Chinese Christians for decades. And he says right now, the pressure against believers in China is even worse than during the Cultural Revolution.
A Chinese person could be put in prison for even talking with a Westerner on the phone, having a Westerner in their home, so people are hesitant, everybody is scared.
Jesus never promised his followers an easy path. In fact, he told his disciples that the world would hate them. He sent them out as sheep among wolves. Jesus' words came true in the life of the apostles, and they're still coming true today in the lives of his followers around the world. Join host Todd Nettleton as we hear their inspiring stories and learn how we can help. Right now on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.
Welcome again to the Voice of the Martyrs Radio. My name is Todd Nettleton, and we have back in our studio today in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, another of our one-named guests. We often at VOM Radio, for security reasons, we don't use last names, so we are back with Uncle Monnie. Uncle Monnie is really an uncle to persecuted church pastors around the world. He is celebrating 40 years of involvement with Christians, specifically in China. We're going to talk about that today. Uncle Monnie, welcome back to Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
Thank you, Todd. Really great to be here.
Let's go back to 40 years ago now. And how did you first get started working with Christians in China?
My first time in China, if you count Hong Kong, was 1975. But my first time inside China was in 1981. The president of a mission agency and I just went on a tour as part of a tour, just so we could go in and begin to see what was going on. The images that I still have in my mind, everybody was walking or riding bicycles. I maybe saw one or two cars the entire day. There were ox carts, lots of horses, and this was in the third largest city of China. That's how it was 40 years ago.
It's changed
a little bit. Yeah, a little bit.
So how did you transition from going in as a tourist with a tour group to being able to sit down with house church pastors and open the Bible and open the scriptures and fellowship together and encourage each other?
Well, I was a missions pastor at 3 mega churches over the years in Seattle and Los Angeles and Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, I met a man who had just retired. He and his wife were now living in Hong Kong. He was serving as kind of the first stop along the trail for people who would take Bibles in or take money in and do various things to be helping the church. They would first stop with this couple. And so I met them, and they said, "You would really love to do some work with the underground church." They introduced me to some people, and then I began to meet and made a really good friend who had been living in China for quite some time. He began introducing me to 5 of the 6 largest house church networks and all their uncles, and we began having many meetings all over the country with these men, probably 10 to 12 meetings I had with them. And they began to get me involved in doing training in lots of their cities. But then I started, the last 14 years, I began primarily just working in one specific province, and it was with missionary training schools. And so these were ones who were preparing to go as missionaries to other parts of the world, primarily to the Muslim world.
We have talked in recent years about the cameras everywhere in China and the facial recognition and obviously different than it was 40 years ago.
We could not do what we were doing 10 years ago now.
Yes, that's
all
what
of
I
it
wanna
has
get to.
changed. It's all changed. And in fact, 3.5 years ago, we were told by our Chinese friends, it's so dangerous now for you to be here and do what you're doing, and so dangerous for us to be with you or for us to be doing any of that we can't have you come anymore. And so I have not been to China for 3.5 years. And it's broken my heart because I was doing that for so long.
Yeah.
In fact, I was going about 4 times a year for 20 years. We figure close to 80 times.
Wow.
I was going just training in with underground church networks in China. And 2 in particular, 2 days after I left, then the police showed up and raided all the place, and everybody was arrested, and everything was confiscated. We lost everything, and they had to start all over.
Did the police know you had been there?
Yeah, they were showing my picture and saying,
who
"Who is this man, and what can you tell me about him?" And so I know that's been going on since the very beginning.
We're talking today on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Uncle Monnie. He is an uncle to persecuted pastors in hostile and restricted nations, coming alongside them, encouraging them, training them. Monty, as you talk to these Chinese future missionaries who are going to go to Islamic countries, they're going to go to the Middle East, they're going to go to Pakistan. In fact, 2 Chinese missionaries were martyred in Pakistan. How does the training for a missionary from China living in hostility, living in persecution, differ to go to a Muslim field than it would be training for me as an American Christian?
My wife and I have both been, I'll just say, in the Middle East with workers there that I trained in China.
Wow.
Okay. And it was just absolutely so much fun to be with them and see all that God had done through them. And we've kept going back, and the things we could tell you, it would just astound you. But they said, well, in class, you told us all this stuff, but we didn't pay a lot of attention to it because you were just an American and because we didn't think that it probably was important. And so forth. They shared a lot of excuses. And then they said, but once we got to the field, we realized we were way over our head and that we should have paid attention.
Interesting.
And that we desperately needed all that. And they said, you know what? And they said, now it would be far better that you didn't do any training for us inside China because it's so dangerous anyway. Let us come out and we'll come into the Middle East and we'll gather our people around every once in a while. And this is what they've now begun doing. And you can take 40 of us and you can teach us for a week. And now you have our undivided attention.
Yes.
We know exactly what you're saying. We know you're not exaggerating. We know that this is what we need to hear. And now our lives depend on it. And we're hanging on every word. That is what the Lord has allowed us to do, is now go and be with many of our friends, be with my sons and daughters, and see what the Lord has done through their lives, the thousands of people that they've touched, a whole people movement that has sprung up among some refugees who've come out of Syria. We'll just leave it at that. But there's lots of things that would be exciting to be able to share with our listeners one-on-one.
Monty, are there particular Chinese Christians that you have known that have inspired your faith, that have inspired the way you follow Christ? Share some of those stories.
One is a couple that designed pearl jewelry. They did it with their his mother and father, because that's what their business was.
Right, the family business.
Family business. And our ministry, VOM, got involved with them and began to help sell some of their pearl jewelry in America. From that, they had decided to save as much money as they could. And they had a very noble project. The noble project was when their second child was born, they had 3 girls. When their second child was born, they at that point had decided not to take her life and have her aborted, but to have her be born. And in doing that, they still could make her legitimate. And I know I'm sounding funny, but could make her legitimate with the government if they paid the $3,200. That would be the fine
for
having a second child. Well, they didn't have $3,200, and so this child had no official name with the government, could not go to school, could not get any medical help.
Wow.
Did not exist.
Yeah.
This child did not exist. Then they had a third girl, and the same thing happened with her. So they had two girls, and they had to raise now $6,400. They didn't have any, and so they began selling this pearl jewelry. They saved their money for a long time until they had enough where they could then buy all the papers so these girls could be legal. And they did. And they're precious girls. I've been with them. So they did that. And then they kept on saving their money. And they tried to learn some English. And they wanted to get more schooling. And I'm going to just say this. They went outside China to a school that taught the Bible. And they then graduated from that school, and then they went back into China as workers in the far west of China because their goal was to work with the Uyghurs. They're the largest Muslim minority group in China, 9.5 million people, and they're very much persecuted by the Chinese government.
Very much persecuted. The Chinese government would see this family. They would have a lot of problems with what they're doing. They're Christians.
Would, but it would be hard for them to track them because they're not on the traditional radar.
What are some of the ways that the church in China is operating differently than it was 40 years ago? Has it changed?
Yeah.
And what are some of the ways that being a Christian in China has changed?
This will be a rough estimate. 80% of the Christians 40 years ago were in unregistered churches. 15% were in registered churches, which means they were government sponsored, and they had quite a number of restrictions that you had to follow. And then there was a small group that would be in the like a young adult, kind of like 20s and 30s in big cities that would kind of drift from city to city, or they might get transferred their jobs from Shanghai to Beijing to Guangzhou to whatever. As that happened, then they had fellowships. They would study the Bible together, pray together, but they didn't function like official churches. The 80% were in rural churches because all of the large house church networks started in rural areas. And so then what they did is they worked in the fields, they worked on their farms, and then maybe for half the year they would have their bicycles and they would go out and do cold portage work, sell Bible portions quietly. They would do preaching. They would help churches, maybe do some baptisms, and they would help in the ministry. Well, all that changes when several 100 million people shift from the rural areas to the urban areas, and the churches all begin growing in the urban areas, and they're leaving all the places where these traditional house church movements had started, and instead they're now in the big cities, and now the husband and wife are both having to work because it's so expensive living in the apartments. So before, they could maybe live for $75 a month in a little place and maybe sleep in a barn, and they could just ride their bikes around, and everything was very cheap. But now, if they have to, even riding a motorcycle, or there's going to be some additional expense, and if they're living in the big cities, they have to pay for all that. So what happened is you had all these hundreds of thousands upon hundreds of thousands of Christians who were the lieutenants, who were all the workers in these large house church networks. Now they've all moved to the cities. Now they don't have any time to do any church work. And so what happened is a number of the movements maybe had 7 million, and then when they all moved to the cities, now they're down to 4 million. Wow. Because they lost so many. It left the leaders in the dust because they were not prepared for all the changes that were taking place.
So how has the church come through those changes and still stayed active and stayed vibrant?
Sometimes they've had to make real compromises, but I'll say it probably in a good way. I'll give you an example. I worked for many years with a house church network that would not work with anybody in the above ground church. So because they were in the underground church and they had so many of their people ratted on and either killed or put in prison, or bad things happened because people would pretend that they were a Christian and then turn them in.
Yep.
So that happened all the time. And so they could not have relations with anybody in an above ground church. And so for years, I could only work with below ground churches, because if they knew that I was working with above ground churches, then I was history. I could no longer have a relationship with them. Well, But what happened was they began to find out that, some of these guys in the above ground church are really good guys. In fact, I'll give you one example. One pastor we were working with, this pastor had been put in prison 4 times for his work by the government. And so he was not loved by the local police. So they then began to work with him, and they found out that he really was a good guy. And they found out that there were things that they could help them with. One, for example, is they would allow all the young people of their church from rural areas to come to the city where they were near the coast, and to stay for 3 months and do it like a internship, like a summer internship.
Oh, yeah.
And they could stay in the church, in the building, because they had a building to be in. And as long as it was for a Christian activity, it was okay to do. They weren't doing anything to break the law. He would do this.
It kind of gave them cover, basically.
It gave them cover. I had one situation where I needed to get some money to one of the pastors in the underground church. Well, I gave the money to this pastor in the above ground church just to see what he would do. Totally honest, he gave the money to them. They were very happy with his help. And so they began to see that maybe instead of just being automatically biased against everybody, that they maybe could pick and choose. Maybe they could say, well, we can't trust these people for these reasons, but these are ones from the above ground church. We can trust them. And so it began to open up a whole new horizon, that there could be other allies that they really would be.
We're on the same team.
We're all on the same team. So that was thrilling for them to see. That was a very important lesson for them to learn.
We're talking today on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Uncle Monnie. He has been involved with the church in China for 40 years. We always want to equip listeners to pray. So how are the key ways that we can pray for the churches in China right now?
I've already told you that they're under a lot of stress. And what's at the heart of it is a Chinese nationalism that is wanting basically everybody of the West out as quick as possible. I mean, they would even have liked it as soon as the end of 2020. But COVID came along and did a number, but we still have more than 90% of all the Westerners out of the country. That doesn't mean that you can't go in as business people and do that, but we're talking about people living there and living full-time as a business or living full-time as a teacher or in some other kind of ministry. That's just not possible. People right and left, just had to leave. A Chinese person could be put in prison for even talking with a Westerner on the phone, having a Westerner in their home. Certainly if they were caught running in a training event with us training Chinese house church pastors or things like that. And so it was just way too dangerous for us to be there and for them to be in any kind of contact with us. And then they began to say, you need to know that we have talked to Christians who were in the very, very small minority back in the 60s during the Cultural Revolution, back when there were less than 1 million Christians in the country. And they said when Mao had his little red book and was urging all of us to worship him as God, and he was wanting us to destroy all the social icons of the past, cultural past, and so forth. And when all of that was taking place, actually, the time now in China is rougher on everybody, but especially the Christians, than even then.
Wow.
Even then, during the Cultural Revolution. And so people don't understand how hard it is, and they can't even say anything, because if they say anything to try and get some public attention, well, then they're going to have their head cut off. Maybe not literally, but they're going to get knocked right back down.
Right.
So people are hesitant. Everybody is scared, and so the way to pray for the church is pray that they would be bold, that they would be brave, that they would do things that is really going to cost them now.
We're talking today on Voice of the Martyrs Radio with Uncle Monty. He is an uncle to pastors in hostile and restricted nations. Monty, I'm going to shift gears, and I want to talk about two countries before we finish up. One is Myanmar. We are seeing Myanmar in the news. We're seeing the unrest. We're seeing protesters being killed. What is that meaning for Christians, for our brothers and sisters in Myanmar?
Well, it's going to mean it's going to go rougher for the Christians. And many of the Christians are in the tribal areas. Some of them, they're not Christians, but some of the ones that have suffered the most are actually Muslim tribal peoples in the far north. And many of them, I think by the hundreds of thousands, have fled into Bangladesh to escape. And so you have many tribals who are suffering. You have a very difficult situation with their current president, who has now been put back in house arrest. I think she's spent a lot of her adult life in house arrest. Yeah. Even winning the Nobel Peace Prize has still not kept her out of trouble. What you have is the beginning where it seemed like it was going to be peaceful, and for the first days it was peaceful, and then a few people got killed, and then pretty soon it just kind of gets out of hand, and then hundreds get killed in a given day, and that's where we're with now. The one who's now in charge, that's taken over as the military leader, he initially had said it would be a year or less, and at least within a year we'll get it back into normal relations and everything will be just fine. Well, that's what we were told, and the last time they said that, it was 49 years later, right, when they finally gave up control. So who knows how long it's going to be? We've heard this before, and so it could very well be a long, dark night again for Myanmar.
During those 49 years, Christians were persecuted. So an important time to pray for the church in Myanmar, to pray for our brothers and sisters there who are looking at this and saying, wow, things are likely going to get worse for us.
Yeah.
Monty, thank you so much for sharing. Your passion for the work just comes out in your voice, and Thank you for being our guest this week on Voice of the Martyrs Radio.
You're welcome. It's been a great joy for me. Tremendous privilege. Thank you, Todd, for everything you do.
Well, it is our pleasure. I want to encourage people. We'll give you a link when you come to VOMradio.net. We've had Uncle Monnie on before. One of the other things we didn't talk about today was his work as a missions pastor for churches here in the United States, but we talked about that the last time he was with us. I would especially encourage you to pass that along to your pastor or to the missions pastor at your church. I want to also encourage you to reach out. Uncle Monnie, several people emailed us last time and said, hey, can I get a message to Uncle Monnie? We passed those along, and he replied to every single one of them. So if you want to reach out to Uncle Monnie, you can do that. You can send us a message through our website, VOMradio.net. If you go to the bottom of the page there's a place where you can send a message to us. You can also just send us an email, radio@vom.org. Again, radio@vom.org. Two things for you as we close out this weekend's episode of the VOM Radio podcast. Really, two favors that I would ask of you. First, if you will, please rate and review VOM Radio wherever you listen to podcasts. That is an important way to help new listeners find our show, find these conversations. So please take just a few minutes and rate and review VOM Radio wherever you listen to podcasts. Secondly, and this is kind of a special ask, we are working on translating some of the episodes of Voice of the Martyrs Radio into other languages. And the exciting part for me is this includes languages spoken by persecuted Christians who live in hostile and restricted nations. I'm looking forward to the day when I get to share these stories in Spanish and Chinese and Arabic and Farsi. What I'd like your help with is picking out the most impactful episodes to translate first. So if you would, take a few minutes, just drop me an email to radio@vom.org and let me know the guests or the interviews that most encouraged or challenged or inspired you, because those are the episodes that we want to translate first. Again, that email address is radio@vom.org. Or you can leave a comment on our website, www.vomradio.net. Thank you for participating, for being a part of this really exciting project. And join us again next week as we continue to explore what God is doing all around the world. Join us again next week right here on the Voice of the Martyrs Radio Network.